Today in the hobby bench, I'll be painting up a pistol-wielding survivor from Warlord Games. So I've got here a Warlord Games survivor, typical gray, dry brush white. And for the skin, I'm painting up using a white undercoat for that. And I found sometimes a lot of these paints that I have, they're a little bit transparent. Now, if I'm going to be using a regular acrylic paint, it's fine. But notice with some of these contrasts, some of the shades, they're a little lighter, a little transparent. So for this one, I'm going to be using Bag of Bones, and I sort of wanted to stray away from like maybe your typical Caucasian look and using pink and stuff like I used in the past. Just trying something a little bit different, maybe a little bit more of a brown, yellowish tone. Not too sure how it's going to look, but I wanted to try something a little bit different, sort of shake it up a little and add some different skin tones and some different hues than you typically would see. So hopefully this will look pretty good. We'll find out. Here you are. It looks pretty good and pretty nice light yellow tone. Something a little bit different from your typical pink. Now I'm going to paint up her top. I'm going to be using fluid pink for this, and that's just sort of the fun thing I think a little bit trying for some of these survivors. You're painting with a bunch of zombies. They're going to be like a lot of these muted tones, look a little grungy. For these survivors, I wanted to just try to stretch my painting palette a little bit and choose some more brighter colors. Something that's have a little bit more fun with it. So I figured, a pink top would look great and just really sort of stand out more on the tabletop with that. And I found this color is just very lovely. I'm surprised really going over a gray primer with a white dry brush, it really had a pretty good coverage for that. And so I'm just carefully going through it one section at a time, trying not to get into any areas where I had the skin. And, this is not thinned out with any water, that sort, pretty much straight from the pot and working through it. And we'll see how it looks. And the result, it's pretty good. I like it. So I'm going to be moving on to our shorts now. And for those, I'm going to be using military yellow. And I want to try to get probably a little bit more of a khaki look for this. So sort of off, like I said, maybe a more neutral shade to sort of offset the really bright pink top. Not make it too crazy. So, carefully going in this and again, getting some good coverage, pretty much straight from the pot. I found military yellow gives a lovely khaki look, really works pretty well. But I did notice sometimes it can be a little thinned out. So in this one, I might try working at 2 coats possibly. And it's not too bad. Pretty much, put down a coat, give a little quick treatment with a hair dryer to sort of dry it out, and then just give another quick coat. And it should hopefully cover pretty well. And you can see here, definitely 2 coats. Probably really worked out and gives it that good khaki look for those shorts. Now I'm going to be working on a webbing, and for this I'm going to use Desert Ochre. I'm still trying to experiment a little bit and get a good go-to color really for leather. But I found that this Desert Ochre works pretty well. It's a little bit more of a yellowish shade rather than maybe say an orange. And I think maybe for leather it gives it that pleasant, I would say maybe burnt leather type look. And it's a little light, not too dark, but I think it gives a pretty good look. And so I'm just going to give it a nice simple coat with this Desert Ochre and just carefully going through it and just trying not to get into other areas and get some good coverage. Now moving on for the rest of the model, I'm going to be working on a hair, also doing a gun, and also work on the hilt of her knife. And so this I'm going to be using Hospitallier Black. Now, I've used Greasy Black a lot before, and I like it, but sometimes it can be probably a tad thinner. Maybe if you want to show off a tad more gray, it works out. This Hospitallier Black is supposed to be more of an intense pigment, and I think you get some really good coverage with this. And so I think for a really dark black, if you really just don't want to necessarily have any highlights or have any thinness sort of showing out from, say, the white dry brush, you get that maybe lighter shades of gray that might be flecked in there. I think this Hospitallier Black works pretty well. Now sometimes you might need to squeeze in maybe another coat or so, but overall I think it looks pretty well. And you can see moving on here, that's exactly what I've got. It gives a really nice coverage, really nice dark gray for that. Now for her shoes and moving on, I'm going to try to again probably add a little more color, so I'm going to be using Omega Blue for that. And I was just sort of experimenting. I think a lot for these modern miniatures, I've been struggling a lot trying to figure out, for tennis shoes, what I'm going to do. But I figured, it might be pretty fun to have something a little bit different from, let's say, your white tennis shoes or just probably a regular loafers and such. So I figured for sure it looks like somebody that might be a little more athletic and maybe like a tennis player. So I figured let's give her some fun looking shoes. So I'm going to try this Omega Blue. Now as I was painting it, I noticed that it had quite a bit of a heel. So I'm probably going to like go back with that and probably touch it up with maybe a different shade. But pretty much giving an even coat as well as I can and really use this very nice intense blue. There you go. For the shoes, I ended up touching it up with some Willow Bark. Pretty neutral, darker brown color. I think it looks pretty good. And that's what I sort of used there. I also used that Omega Blue for her water bottle in the back. But now I'm going to be painting up here for her knife blade, actually itself. I'm going to be using Gunmetal Gray. And this is just like a traditional metallic acrylic paint from Vallejo. Now, when you're working with metallics, I like to try to have everything sort of separate from the normal stuff that I use. So I have my typical palette that I'll be using. You might have seen before, the ceramic dish. For my metallics, I have a completely separate palette that I use for mixing up my color. Same thing for my water. I'm going to be using a container specifically I use for metallic paints that I'll be using for thin out or for, washing my brush. I want to try to avoid having those metal flakes get into my other paints. So I want to try to be careful about that. And here, I'm just covers pretty well. I like the color. It's sort of a dull metal color, not too gaudy, not too bright and sharp. So I think it works great for this knife blade. And you pretty much take it down a simple coat, and that's about it. Now, at this point here, you could say the miniature's done. Everything's pretty much covered up. These contrast paints look really great. They add that shading. But I want to give it just a little bit more of a pop, if you will, add a little bit more depth. And so I'm going to be going back over some of these colors and just using some acrylic paints. In this case here, I'm going to use pink for a top and really try to bring out the highlights here. Now, I think if I was just going to work on a bunch of zombies or if I had tons and tons of survivors, I probably wouldn't do this. I think the way it's looking right now, it looks great. But I find sometimes, you want to add just a little bit more depth. You want to add just some more texture to those colors. And, the white dry brush over gray primer works great for that. It does add that shading and allows me a little bit more of that thinness, the highlights to bring out and get a little bit more gradations of shade in your color. But I typically find I want to sort of go back and accentuate those highlights just a little bit more. So that's what I'll be doing in the pink. And let's go over the raises and folds of her top there and, going on the edges a little bit. And some areas I think are going to catch a little bit more light, maybe like on our sleeves and up on our chest. That's where I'm going to go ahead and just give a little bit more color there. Now this is thinned out some, so it's not going to be necessarily very opaque. I just want to try to add a little bit more shading to this, a little bit more depth, and just try to refine those highlights a little bit more. And you can see, especially working here now, more on her shoulder. I'm going to look at those areas that catch a lot of light, and that's where I'm really going to focus on. So the other areas that are maybe a little bit further down on her shirt and then those deeper folds, I'm not going to cover, and really just try to use the upper shades to capture that light and use that pink. Now for this last bit, I'm going to sort of do the same thing. I'm going to be using beige. And pretty much like I did for the top, I'm going to work on the shade a little bit more on her shorts, trying to cover some more of those upper folds, give that a little bit more of a different look and sort of bring out a little bit more highlight. In this case here, this beige is a little bit of a different shade. So I'll actually be working a little bit more on this and really try to give it more of a different color in the end that you're going to see. And really, again, focusing on areas I think they're going to catch more light. So obviously it's those upper folds of her shorts and looking through probably some areas probably on the top of her shorts, maybe that might be catching light above her knees. That's what I'll be working on. And so for the areas that are like a little bit more further down, probably underneath the webbing and stuff, or underneath her belt, I try to leave those if I can. But I'm just going to really work through and try to find those upper areas and focus on those. And this pistol wielding survivor is done. That's it. You can see, I really like that pink. I love the blue shoes. Adds a bit of color to that. Really makes it sort of stand out and pop quite a bit more. And you can see here now, going back to the shorts and up to our top, just adding that little bit more of those acrylic colors sort of helps bring out a tad more depth. But you get great coverage anyways with those contrast paints. So you're probably going to leave it at that. But I just wanted to add a little bit more, and that's sort of what I did. In this case here, I just sort of threw down some PVA glue and some flock with a little bit of a gray base for some concrete. And I think this survivor is done. Can't wait to play with her on the tabletop.